lightning Saturday. They must have known just how I like it, 'cause everything's coming my way.
Butlin came up with the catchy slogan, holidays with pay, holidays with play. A week's holiday for a week's wage.
Yesterday everything looked anyhow.
The morning to bedtime activities provided by the relentlessly jolly redcoats seemed to be exactly what grey Britain needed. Billy Butlin offered colour and fun and, for the time, surprisingly good food. So when the news arrived about the Italians invading Abyssinia or the Nuremberg rallies, here there was a constant diet of distraction, from light opera to ballroom dancing to the notorious knobbly knees and glamorous grannies contests. You didn't get that in the Hitler Youth.
On the 12th of March, 1938, Hitler's troops marched into Austria. In Britain, we had a new Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. He announced that nothing could have arrested this action by Germany unless we and others had been prepared to use force to prevent it. And they weren't. Appeasement, not confrontation, was the British way.
The word appeasement is now loaded with shame and embarrassment, but it once had a gentler meaning, simply to bring peace or calm down. And as a strategy for dealing with Hitler, never forget that it was hugely popular with millions of Britons who supported it at every stage. Appeasement was pursued by politicians and diplomats with skill, determination, and even nerve, like a chess game. Only one problem: Hitler wasn't playing chess.
The guns boomed from the mountains behind Godesberg as 1 million German men turned field and forest into a practice battleground.
Once Austria was folded into the Reich, Hitler turned his attention to part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland on Germany's eastern border. Chamberlain did nothing.
By all accounts, Chamberlain was not an appealing man. He was cold and he was sarcastic, but he wasn't stupid. He'd had a finger in almost every international crisis since the early 1930s. He thought that only his wisdom had kept Britain out of the Spanish Civil War. Only he could soothe Mussolini. And when he became Prime Minister at last, he said, "I only have to raise a finger, and the whole face of Europe is changed." Chamberlain's problem wasn't ignorance. It was colossal and tragic vanity.
A gasp of amazement and satisfaction runs round the world. The Prime Minister decides to fly to a personal meeting with the German Chancellor. The world has realized that war would be a folly and a crime.
When Chamberlain arrived in Munich, he was greeted by saluting Nazis. He responded by waving his Homburg hat. Then it was off to Hitler's Alpine retreat, Berchtesgaden, and the mission of his life.
This was history's first modern summit, and it was give and take. British give and German take. Chamberlain accepted entirely that 3 million Czechs wanted to leave their country and join the Reich, and promised to do his bit to bully the Czech government into agreeing. And in return he got what? A short delay and the German promise not to actually invade Czechoslovakia unless, of course, they were provoked by terrorist incidents on the border. Round one to Hitler.
Britain was selling Czechoslovakia down the river, but when Chamberlain returned home, This diplomatic disgrace was greeted with huge enthusiasm. Anything to avoid war.
The tumult and the clamour are for the man who has brought to politics the common sense point of view of the man in the street. On his sane judgment, we base our hopes of peace and happiness.
Two weeks later, Chamberlain was off again. At a summit on the Rhine, Hitler gave notice that German troops were now ready to invade the Sudetenland. Chamberlain protested, but Hitler had decided he was a ninny. But in Britain, the mood was now rapidly changing. Preparations for war were underway. Churchill's instincts had been right all along, and at last people were starting to listen.
One senior official at the Foreign Office wrote in his diary that he knew Britain was in no condition to fight, but I'd rather be beat than dishonoured. How could we look any foreigner in the face after this?
Then Hitler blinked. Instead of invading Czechoslovakia, he called yet another summit. Chamberlain called it the last desperate snatch at the last tuft on the very verge of the precipice. The summit didn't achieve much. Chamberlain persuaded Hitler to sign a waffle-filled piece of paper.
And the Prime Minister comes home to a welcome that he will never forget.
On his return, Chamberlain was met by a large crowd waiting in the rain. He waved his precious piece of paper and read it out.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Back at Downing Street, there was another cheering crowd. Chamberlain leaned out of a window and announced that he had brought back peace with honour. It was, he said, peace for our time. On the 1st of September 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Chamberlain gave Hitler an ultimatum: withdraw or face the consequence.
The fateful hour of 11 has struck, and Britain's final warning to Hitler having been ignored, a state of war once more exists between Great Britain and Germany.
With the declaration of war, there was a steady crescendo of demands for Winston Churchill's return to government. Chamberlain bowed to the inevitable and invited Churchill to join his war cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty.
We tried again and again to prevent this war. And for the sake of peace, we put up with a lot of things happening which ought not to have happened. But now we are at war, and we are going to make war, and persevere in making war until the other side have had enough of it.
Churchill hadn't set foot in the Admiralty since 1915, but when he went in and opened a cupboard, he found one of his own old maps charting Royal Naval positions from the Great War still hanging there. Later that day, the Admiralty sent the fleet a signal. It consisted of just 3 words: Winston is back.